So get ready because we are diving headfirst into a deep dive on Jewish divorce law, specifically Gett refusal.
Right.
We've got a lot of really interesting sources on this.
Yes.
We've got excerpts from rabbinical rulings. We've got scholarly articles from the Jewish Women's Archive. And we've even got some stuff from the International Beit Din's website.
Right, which is fascinating.
So much to unpack here.
It is.
But let's just dive right in. So sometimes a marriage ends, but one person just can't seem to move on.
Right.
Well, imagine that, but with centuries of tradition and serious legal complexities all woven in.
That's where this whole concept of an Aguna comes in. This refers to a woman whose husband refuses to grant a Gett, which is the document that's essential for a Jewish divorce.
So it's not just about ending a marriage on paper. It's about being religiously bound, unable to truly move on with your life.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that without that Gett, a woman isn't just considered still married. She is actually forbidden from remarrying in the eyes of Halachic.
Right.
And any future relationships are considered adulterous.
Wow.
Which carries serious social and Halachic ramifications for both her and any children that might come from that relationship.
And that's where that term mamzerim comes in, right?
Yeah, mamzerim is a heavy term.
Right.
It refers to the children of a marriage that took place without a proper Gett.
Right.
And it labels them as legitimate within the eyes of Halachic.
Right.
And it creates immense obstacles for those children to marry within the Orthodox community.
Yeah, that's a huge deal for a lot of people.
It is a pervasive fear for many Agunot.
Wow. So this problem's been around for centuries, though, right?
Yeah, it's not new.
It's not just a product of modern times.
No, not at all.
Hmm.
The Jewish Women's Archive actually details how back in the 19th and 20th centuries, during those massive waves of Jewish migration to the U.S.,
Right.
husbands would sometimes just disappear,
Oh, wow.
leaving their wives in limbo.
Oh,
Unsure of their marital status, lives put on hold.
wow.
And they often turned to newspapers for help. Publications like the Vorwärts and Hamagi.
Like historical precedent to what we see online.
Exactly. Trying to track down these missing husbands.
It's fascinating.
It is.
And this wasn't just a U.S. thing.
No, not at all.
Right.
Think about World War I.
Oh, right.
The sheer number of missing soldiers created thousands of Agunot.
Wow.
Women left in agonizing uncertainty.
So if Gett refusal isn't a new problem, what are the root causes? Is it all about the money?
Yeah, there's a tendency to oversimplify it as just a financial matter,
Right.
as if it's always about men angling for a better financial settlement in the divorce.
Right.
But our sources reveal a much more complex picture.
Like what is going on?
Well, for one thing, consider the power dynamics inherent in traditional interpretations of Jewish marriage laws.
Okay.
The act of granting a Gett rests solely with the husband.
So the power to end the marriage religiously rests entirely in his hands.
Yes, and this unilateral authority, especially when wielded with ill intent, can be a form of control,
Wow.
a way to dictate the terms of the divorce.
So it's less about the money and more about the power.
In many cases, yes. Power play, a way to exert control, even as the marriage itself is crumbling.
That's incredibly disheartening. Are there any ways around this?
Well, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The International Beit Din, or IBD, has a whole section on their website dedicated to what they call Halachic methods for addressing Gett refusal.
Okay.
Some of these approaches are surprisingly creative.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about these loopholes.
All right, one approach involves scrutinizing the original marriage ceremony itself.
Okay.
It turns out that even what might seem like a minor violation of Halachic during that ceremony, for example, having a witness who's related to the bride or groom, or someone who openly doesn't follow the laws of Shabbat, that can potentially be grounds to declare the entire marriage invalid.
Wow. Talk about sweating the small stuff. What other loopholes are we talking about?
Another one that often sparks a lot of debate is the concept of mum gadol.
Okay.
If the husband had a significant undisclosed flaw before the marriage, the marriage itself could be considered void.
Okay. Major flaw.
We're talking about things like previously undisclosed impotence,
Oh, wow.
mental illness, criminal past,
Okay.
that had the wife known about them would have likely been considered deal breakers.
And these situations were not disclosed beforehand.
Exactly. It's about significant information that was hidden.
Wow.
And there's even debate within Halachic circles about whether a history of domestic violence against previous partners could fall under this category.
Wow, that brings up a whole other level of complexity considering the sensitive nature of domestic violence.
Absolutely. It's a sensitive and challenging area.
Yeah.
And the IBD even addresses the issue of deception, which can also be a basis for annulment.
Okay.
For example, Let's say a man lied about his finances or hid significant criminal behavior before the marriage.
Right.
This could be considered kedushay tat,
Okay.
a marriage that took place under false pretenses.
So like a Jewish prenup gone very wrong.
You could say that. It's crucial to remember that none of these are simple, easy outs.
Right.
Each case requires careful, meticulous examination,
Right.
often going against more conservative interpretations of halakha.
And I'm guessing that's where the controversy begins, right? Because there are always those who feel some interpretations are too liberal, too willing to stray from tradition.
Precisely. And that internal debate, that tension within the Orthodox world, is a crucial part of understanding this whole issue.
So let's unpack that a bit. Whose toes are being stepped on here? And what are the consequences of challenging the status quo when it comes to something as fundamental as divorce?
Well, a perfect example of this clash is the story of Rabbi Morgenstern.
Okay.
Established a Beit Din in New York that was known for its willingness to annul marriages in cases of Gett refusal. You know, he wasn't afraid to employ those Halachic loopholes we were just talking about.
Right.
But his approach sparked intense opposition.
Intense in what ways? What kind of pushback did he face?
Like threats,
Wow.
ostracism from parts of the community, even physical attacks.
Wow.
He was labeled a radical, a heretic by some,
Okay.
all for daring to challenge these deeply ingrained interpretations of Jewish law.
Wow. So it's not just an intellectual debate.
No, not alone.
These are real lives that are being impacted.
Exactly. And the Jewish Women's Archive highlights how Rabbi Morgenstern wasn't alone.
Oh, really?
There were other rabbis who quietly annulled marriages using those same Halachic principles.
Right.
But they were too afraid of the backlash to do so openly.
Wow.
They feared being shunned by their communities, losing their positions, their livelihoods,
Right.
all for trying to help women trapped in these impossible situations.
It's a classic case of don't ask, don't tell,
Right.
which, as we know, doesn't really pave the way for progress. Why is there so much resistance to change when it comes to this?
Well, a lot of it stems from this fear that making it easier to dissolve a marriage will somehow undermine the sanctity of marriage itself.
But isn't trapping someone in a loveless or even abusive marriage far more damaging?
That's a core question in this whole debate.
Right.
Some argue that maintaining a man's absolute authority in granting the get,
Okay.
it provides incentive for him to invest in the marriage,
Right.
to fulfill his responsibilities.
Okay.
The logic being that if a woman can just walk away without his consent, men will be less likely to commit.
So the thought process is that men are purely motivated by a fear of losing control.
You could put it that way. But our sources point to the problematic assumption underlying that.
Which is?
That men are only driven by self-interest, by this need for control.
Right.
It ignores the possibility of genuine commitment.
Right.
Of men who would uphold their marital obligations regardless of legal loopholes.
And not to mention, it completely disregards a woman's right to choose her autonomy.
Precisely. It's a viewpoint that many, especially those advocating for Agunot, find deeply troubling.
Yeah.
They argue that focusing solely on the husband's motivations completely misses the bigger picture.
What is the bigger picture then?
The well-being of both parties involved,
Right.
and the integrity of the divorce process itself.
Okay.
The ideal is to create a system that honors halakha, while also ensuring fairness, preventing coercion, and protecting those who are most vulnerable.
Okay, so what are some of the paths being proposed to achieve that balance?
Well, there are two main schools of thought emerging. You could call them the proactive and reactive approaches.
Yeah.
Proactive approach aims to prevent Gett refusal from happening in the first place
Okay.
by changing the very structure of the Jewish marriage ceremony itself.
Okay, that's a pretty radical idea. How would that work?
So some rabbis, like Rabbi Adler and Rabbi Richman, have proposed alternative egalitarian wedding ceremonies.
Okay.
They would grant both parties equal power in dissolving the marriage.
So it's like building a prenup directly into the wedding vows.
In a way, yes. These ceremonies, by design, eliminate the need for a get altogether.
Wow, but that's got to be a tough sell in more traditional communities.
Absolutely.
Right.
Which is why the other approach, the reactive approach,
Okay.
focuses on how to address get refusal when it does occur.
Okay.
This involves empowering rabbinical courts to be more proactive in applying existing halakhic mechanisms to dissolve these marriages.
So instead of simply waiting for the husband to have a change of heart,
Right.
the courts would take a more assertive stance.
Yes. They would actively seek out those halakhic loopholes, like Mumgadal or Kiddushay Tat that we talked about,
Right.
working to annul the marriages where Get refusal is clearly being used as a tool of manipulation or control.
That makes a lot of sense. But won't that likely face some of the same resistance? That same fear of bending the rules too far?
Undoubtedly, there will be pushback.
Yeah.
However, many argue that the current system, with its inherent power imbalance,
Right.
is simply unsustainable.
Right.
It's not fair, it's not ethical, and it's not just to leave women chained to unwanted marriages, their lives on hold indefinitely.
You mentioned earlier that there are different approaches to divorce outside of the Orthodox world.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure. So both Reform and Reconstructionist movements
Okay.
have very different approaches to divorce, giving women much more autonomy and agency within the process.
Okay.
However, the Orthodox world, particularly in Israel, where religious, not civil courts, have sole jurisdiction over Jewish divorce,
Right.
those options aren't available.
So it's a catch-22.
It is.
Stuck between upholding tradition and addressing a very real need for justice.
It's a delicate balance, to be sure.
Right.
And it raises a really important question.
Which is?
What responsibility do individuals and communities have to support women facing these challenges?
Right.
Even if it means challenging traditional interpretations.
It's kind of heavy to think about something as fundamental as divorce, this battleground.
Yeah.
We've been talking about, get refusal within Jewish law.
Right.
But this issue also, has broader conversations that are happening right now
Absolutely.
about the role of women in Orthodox Judaism.
100%.
I mean, it has to look at some, patriarchal structures
Yeah.
and ask these difficult about, autonomy and equality, all within the context of halakha.
Right. And how those things all intersect.
Right, because it's you're these ancient laws and traditions that have guided Jewish life for centuries. And then the modern world, which, individual rights and evolving social norms. So how do those two perspectives find balance?
That is the heart of the challenge, isn't it?
Right.
Navigating that tension.
Right.
How do we honor tradition while also making sure that halakha is applied in a way that's just and compassionate and responsive to the needs of today?
Because it's not about just discarding tradition.
Right.
It's about understanding how to interpret and apply those rules in a way that reflects our values.
And that's where I find this concept of halakhic creativity so fascinating.
Yeah.
Because as we saw with those examples from the International Beit Din,
Right.
there is room for flexibility
Right.
within Jewish law
Okay.
for solutions that address modern challenges
Right.
without compromising those core principles.
So it's about working within the system to try to find a more just outcome.
Exactly. And really look at the history of halakha. Not a new phenomenon.
Right.
Rabbis have been wrestling with these kinds of issues for centuries,
Yeah.
using their knowledge and ingenuity to adapt Jewish law to changing social landscapes.
So I guess that brings us back to that, just what can we do as individuals, as communities, to ensure that no one is held hostage in a marriage against their will?
Well, I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
You have to understand the nuances of the issue, the very real human cost of get refusal,
Yeah.
to begin to address it.
Education is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The more we know,
Mhm.
better equipped we are to advocate for change,
Right.
to support those who are struggling.
And that support can come in a lot of different forms, right?
It can mean donating to organizations that provide legal aid and resources for Aguna,
Right.
or even just lending a listening ear to someone who's going through this.
Right. And speaking up, right? Challenging this idea that, get is somehow like a matter that should just be ignored.
Exactly. This isn't just a private matter.
Right.
This affects the entire community,
It does.
and it's something that demands our collective attention and action.
So as we kind of wrap this deep dive,
Okay.
I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
What if a solution to get refusal lies not just in laws, but in changing our mindset?
Ooh, I like that. What if we shifted our perspective?
Right. What if instead of viewing marriage as this contract
Right?
that one person can just hold hostage, what if we embraced these values of mutual respect, autonomy, compassion?
Yeah.
And what if we fostered a culture where divorce, while never easy, is seen as a legitimate option to be approached with dignity and compassion,
Yes.
regardless of gender?
Love it. It's definitely something to ponder.
Yeah.
And makes the starting point for a more just and equitable future
For sure.
for everyone within the Jewish community.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a world where every voice is heard and everyone is free to live a life of meaning and purpose.